Hey everybody, welcome back to Mass Office Hours, brought to you by the Mass Research Review. Uh, I feel like you, the viewing audience, has been robbed. Normally we do like a nice 10-minute run-up with the critically acclaimed elevator music, also known as Muzak. Uh, this week you got shorted. We only gave you about 2 minutes of lead time there, so I hope you soaked up those 2 minutes. And if you're listening to this on the podcast feed after the fact, you're really missing out. So the folks who join us live on YouTube, we have this 10-minute countdown with music that a lot of people say, Helms, it's their favorite song in the entire world. People have asked me if they can download it to work out to it, if they could play it for the first dance at their wedding. People really love that song. So we'll try to get there earlier next time and give you that full 10-minute run-up that everyone is looking forward to every single week. Hopefully everyone made it here safely with the time change. Time changes are always very confusing. But we are now on Eastern Daylight Time. Oh, I need to change the banner on YouTube. Ignore what you're seeing in front of your eyes. But yeah, so we're here every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, which is now Eastern Daylight Time, UTC -4. Helms, you're in New Zealand. I don't know what that means for you. Does this time change make life easier or harder for you?
It's relatively a negligible change. It is now Tuesday at noon, and it
Okay.
had previously been an hour later than that. What's wild for the folks who wanted to have their minds blown is that not only am I on the other side of the international date line in the Southern Hemisphere a day ahead, however, being in the Southern Hemisphere means that the order of the seasons is reversed. So we're coming out of summer, not winter,
Right.
going into the next season. So when we spring forward and fall back is the opposite of when you guys do. So the
Oh,
time, yeah, that's the wild one. So the time difference for any given time zone in the Northern Hemisphere can differ depending upon whether or not you guys observe daylight savings compared to us by a 2-hour window, window. So for example, the time difference across the year that I experience, even though I'm a day ahead with California, ranges between 3 to 5 hours.
wow. That's too much, man. You should just move
Yep.
back. Just embrace the freedom, move back. I know it was too much freedom to handle at first, but just you will grow into it. I trust that you will. But anyway, hey folks, we got some fitness stuff to get into. If you Before we get into the fitness questions, a couple reminders. If you like the show by any chance and you would like to support it in some way, there are many ways to do that. You could like, rate, subscribe, and review wherever you get the show. We do it live on YouTube every Wednesday. We leave those episodes up in perpetuity. And then we also put this podcast up on your favorite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, you name it. I think we get all of them, all the big ones at least. You could also support the show by telling a friend, send them a link to the YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, etc. If you want to submit questions for us to answer, you can do that by going to massresearchreview.com/office hours with a hyphen between the words office and hours. And of course, the best way to support us is you could join us live on YouTube every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The best way to get your questions answered is to hop into the live chat and enjoy your evening or morning or whatever it is where you are with us every Wednesday. So let's get into some content here. Helms, a lot
Yes,
of our
sir.
listeners know that Office Hours obviously is brought to you by the Mass Research Review. If you really love the show, you could consider subscribing. Get more info at massresearchreview.com. But Helms, recently you wrote an article in the Mass Research Review about stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the real unique element of this article was not that it was about stretch-mediated hypertrophy, but that it was stretch-mediated hypertrophy of the pecs. If my understanding is correct, most of that literature has been on the calf. We've seen a lot of studies of people putting on these semi-torture devices that look like boots, stretching their calves for very long periods of time. So at first it was really a calf-focused literature, which, as we all know, is the most meaningless body part. No one should worry about growing their calves because it doesn't happen. But Helms, what did we learn from this new study that expands the stretch-mediated hypertrophy universe into the pec world?
No, I love the way you frame that. So this is absolutely a study for the BDSM enthusiast. Um, and that's when you look at the study, you can see there is a pretty extreme pec stretching device. And the reason I brought up BDSM, which of course, as we all know, is bench, deadlift, squat, military press enthusiasts. And you put the B first because you care about pec growth. If you thought anything else when I said that, shame on you. So this specific study is actually really important because it links to something that I'm writing about in our upcoming Mass article, Mass issue, which will be a little teaser for those subscribers on the topic of replication. This is a replication in a different muscle group, which really helps us understand the scope that we can consider stretch-mediated hypertrophy to be potentially relevant. But it has a number of features, this study, that is worth talking about because they changed the intensity, they changed the duration, and they changed the frequency of the stretching, in addition to changing the muscle group, which I think is all really important changes because, like I said, and like you said, actually, all of the research to this point, at least in humans, that is finding robust hypertrophy in response to stretching has been in the calves. So, to talk about it a little bit, just for some background for those who are not aware, we have known about stretch-mediated hypertrophy being a thing for actually quite a long time, but largely it has only been done in animal models. And the reason why there's a ton of interest in this is because of the absolute bonkers hypertrophy that has been observed in some of these animal models. Bit of a trigger warning for anyone who's an animal lover before I briefly get into this background. But in these animal models, they're doing things that the animals are absolutely not enjoying, and they're being stretched continuously by typically putting some type of weight or using a stretching apparatus that provides a constant stretch, not for hours, but for days and sometimes weeks. And at the end of that, they are sacrificed, and their limb weights are weighed, and they actually look at changes in cross-sectional area, muscle weight, also the addition of new muscle fibers, so hyperplasia, which is something that you cannot really effectively measure in humans until we get better in vivo tech that doesn't require, dissection or vivisection. I guess it would be in vivo if they're still alive. Also not allowed by ethics boards. So anyway, what I'm talking about in terms of magnitudes of hypertrophy is on the order of like 80 to 140% increases in, say, limb muscle size or wing muscle size in animals, and this has been observed largely in avian models, so chickens and quails, but some research has also been done in, I believe, rabbits and rodents. So that is nuts. And an interesting thing is that it's not just hypertrophy via sarcomeres in series. What the heck is that? Well, if you remember back to Exercise Physiology 101, sarcomere is the smallest functional unit of a muscle. That is actually where you got your actin and myosin connected to titin, doing the whole excitation, contraction, coupling, and sliding together, sliding filament theory, all that fun stuff. One form of hypertrophy is the formation of new sarcomeres so that you can effectively lengthen a muscle more. Because one thing that stretching will not do is change the location of your tendons, but it does allow for more stretch tolerance and increased lengthening of a muscle through potentially either one, just being more tolerant to stretch subjectively, or two, actually changing the muscle morphology so that you can achieve a higher stretch. But in addition to sarcomeres in series being observed, large changes in cross-sectional area and muscle thickness have been observed. So it induces hypertrophy in a lot of ways. So there's, of course, an interest for clinical applications, for the position in which you might immobilize a limb for someone who's recovering from a bone injury, and also for crazy bodybuilders like myself who are looking for new and fun ways of trying to break plateaus and get bigger muscles. So because we can't replicate these same crazy methods in animals, in humans, most of the human research on this topic was nothing to write home about for decades and wasn't even attempted. And most of the stretching protocols didn't produce hypertrophy consistently and largely were ineffective for the purposes of strength and hypertrophy generation until a PhD student out of Germany, who I believe is probably close to finishing their PhD if they haven't already, Konstantin Warnecke, did a series of studies all on trying to figure out, can we replicate some of these findings that we're seeing in animals and humans, initially starting with him just seeing what's the tolerance to this, what's a good muscle as a model for it, and doing the preliminary work to eventually determine that, hey, we can actually get some people to be okay with putting their foot in a calf stretching boot for an hour, and even in one study, 2 hours per day, but an hour they're more likely to do 7 days per week, and having that boot hold you in extreme dorsiflexion for an hour per day at a stretch tolerance of 8 out of 10 pain. And in multiple studies, he showed that you can get pretty large increases in muscle thickness in response to the stretching protocol that were actually comparable to doing resistance training 3 times a week, 5 sets of, your typical hypertrophy range is 2 failure of calf raises. Another interesting finding that he produced was that it seemed that men grew in response to this more than women, which may or may not be a true sex difference, or just that men on average are less pliable, have less range of motion about a joint, aren't as flexible, and that you can achieve higher levels of tension in someone who's less flexible by stretching them than those who are more flexible. There still was growth in women, but it was about 50% to 2/3 of that observed in men. Now, the big critique of this research was twofold. One, just like you said, this is all in the calves, and related to that, on the topic of replication, it all came from the same lab. And anytime we talk about replication, this disclaimer is really important. It is not that we think the lab doing the research is doing data fabrication or fraud. No, not at all. It's that in our field, we have small sample size research. So the possibility of random chance sampling variance or systematic errors confounding the data that influence one group but not another are much higher when you have smaller sample sizes. So replication is very important in different conditions by a different group to make sure that the findings are representative and generalizable. So the fact that this present study by Wolin and colleagues was done in a different lab setting, Warnicki was still one of the authors, but I don't think it was done in the same lab, and it was done with a different muscle group and a different protocol, and without bearing the lead, did find similar results, is very encouraging. But there's other aspects of this that are pretty cool. One of the taglines I put in this article was that the world recently learned extreme calf stretching can be as effective for hypertrophy as calf resistance training. Unsurprisingly, the world didn't care. Because like you said, the calves are like, and more importantly, when you look at what you had to do, okay, I'm going to get this boot, and I'm going to be an hour per day stretching my calves. And if I only have one boot, 2 hours per day, if I'm not doing a unilateral subject design within subject design like a participant in this study, to get the same thing I could get by just doing calf raises for 45 minutes a week. Ultimately, it was deemed that this was logistically infeasible. So what is really cool about the present study is they did not use that same protocol. They did use something that from the actual device is not very feasible, but the implications are a higher level of feasibility. So what they specifically had these people do was they came to the lab 4 times per week, and they stretched for just 15 minutes, not a full hour. And they were in this device where they essentially strapped them at the elbows while they were lying on their back with their knees and hips bent with their feet on the wall, so they couldn't arch their lower back and reduce the stretch. And the straps were connected beneath them to the floor, if you imagine they're lying facing the ceiling. And they would self-ratchet anytime there was additional change in range of motion about the shoulder joint. So they first strapped them in, and they strapped them in not to an 8 out of 10 pain, Trex, but to their maximum stretch tolerance.
Wow,
so
10 out of 10.
10 out of 10, exactly. And then what they did, and this is pretty cool, is they actually attached a load cell to the strap so they could measure the resultant and reactive muscle force being generated by the pecs. And each time there was a contraction in response to being ratcheted down, you'd see the muscle force go up, and as they were able to relax and it came down and the range of motion increased, those self-ratcheting straps, they'd lock them in even deeper. So for the 15 minutes, they were constantly staying at a 10 out of 10 automatically. Needless to say, I can tell you these folks probably did not enjoy this. They were basically in extreme discomfort for 15 minutes straight. And that's a long time, and 15 minutes does not go quickly when you're in extreme discomfort.
I was going to say, like,
it worked.
Not to derail the conversation, but I went to, on a rainy day to kill time when I was traveling, I went to a museum of crime, and there was a bunch of, like, medieval devices for punishing criminals that don't sound that dissimilar from what you're describing. So this does not sound like, oh, cool, I can just do this instead of lifting. Like, this is some really uncomfortable stuff, it sounds like.
Well, not to make light of the prisoner experience, but it sounds like for a very long time, people have been able to get jacked in prison just by different means than the current access they have to a gym environment. So,
Yeah.
yeah, whether it's a stretch-mediated torture device or whether it's the break you get to go pump some iron, prisoners be jacked.
Yeah.
So
So you said it worked.
it did work, yes. So 15 minutes of a higher intensity stretch using this specific device 4 times per week in one group. There was a control group as well. This is actually a really well-designed study, just to put it out there. They recruited like around 80 people, split them up between 3 groups, men and women. One group did the stretching as I described. One group was the non-training, non-stretching control, and the final group did 3 15-minute sessions of pec flies, doing 5 sets of 10 to 12 reps to failure 3 times per week. So the time disparity in these is not like it was in the Warnicki calf training group of 45 minutes versus 7 hours. It is 1 hour per week versus 45 minutes, which is a huge change in terms of feasibility. I don't think anyone's putting their hand up and saying, yes, I would like to be in this medieval torture device. But just comparatively, it is making it sound like, oh, maybe the duration does not need to be that long. And it's unclear whether that means that the intensity has to be that much higher or if that's just a different feature. We do need more research. But anyway, what they found was changes between 5 to 7% in terms of increases in muscle thickness in the left and right pec, and roughly 10% increases in strength, because they tested all 3 groups on an isometric pec fly, basically, in the same position that they're being stretched or in the bottom position of where they're being trained, because they did pec flies for the resistance training. And I think that is really cool. So, so we've got replication, we've got a different muscle group, and we've also got a pretty good study design, and we've got an increase in feasibility. So the take homes from this are that it's probably true that if you can find an extreme stretch that gives you the sensation of 8, 9, or 10 out of 10, and you can do that for a reasonably long period of time, 15 minutes to an hour, and you can do that pretty regularly, 4 to 7 times a week, you should be able to get comparable hypertrophy to typical volume ranges, somewhere in that, say, 10 to 15 set range of training near failure for a given muscle group. Now, I don't know yet if this is potentially complementary to resistance training, and that's a big question. It's an open question. But what I can confidently say, and this is kind of the lowest, conservative application of these findings, is that if you are in a position where you cannot get access to weights, or body weight training is not feasible, perhaps there's a joint issue, perhaps you're just too strong if you're a well-trained person and you're traveling and you don't want to do 1 billion push-ups. If you can find a way to stretch a given muscle group and hold it for a long period of time, let's say in your hotel room or something while traveling, you should be able to actually induce a similar stimulus to resistance training. And there are certain muscle groups that are very hard to train body weight, like the hamstrings are notoriously something very challenging to train, especially if you're on your own. If you've got someone with you, you can do Nordics. But if you don't, how are you going to train those hamstrings? Well, maybe you don't need to. Maybe you just need to do a pretty extreme sit and reach test and hold it for a good chunk of time on your quote unquote traveling leg day. And you can also do some reverse Nordics, like quads, on your own, which you can typically set up if you have the knee discomfort issue worked out. Some people just can't bend that far back. Or you can do sissy squats, or you can even do single leg supported squats. There's ways to train the quads relatively easily, especially if you're comfortable being uncomfortable. But the hamstrings are a tough one. Calves, pretty easy to train when you're traveling. You just need to do single leg body weight, pause at the bottom, and you're typically in a reasonable-ish rep range. But hamstrings are a tough one, so that's a great example. If you can do a crap ton of push-ups and don't want to deal with it, and you would choose your poison to be a really gnarly door stretch that you hold for a while you're watching some TV, that's another option. Some other things are harder to stretch, but I think if you were just to think about the general applications of this, you go, oh, wow, that's actually quite nice. And if we go back a few years to the dark times of COVID, we probably think, oh, this would have been good information to have when I was, incorporating things like using that one kettlebell I have for Bulgarian split squats on my leg day and nothing else. And even if I didn't need some variety, I'd prefer to torture myself than do the same thing I did for the last 12 weeks. So those are the general findings. Like I said, strength changes were very similar between groups, and I mean that truly. I'm not just overstating a non-significant difference. When we looked at the isometric maximal strength in the stretching group, it was 10.16% increase. It was 10.3% in the strength group, and the control group was less than 1%. And the thickness changes in the strength group were between 5 to 7, and they were between 5 to 6 for the stretching group. The only thing that really differed between groups was the changes in range of motion, which in the calf research, interestingly enough, did not differ between groups, although you can maybe suggest that when you looked at the meaningfulness of those changes and their magnitude without just interpreting the raw p-value, were a little better in the stretching group than the calf training group. But they're clearly better here when you look at the data on range of motion increases. So the stretching group had like a nearly 9% increase in the range of motion the way they tested it, while it was around like 2.4% in the strength group. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. Definitely a fun read. And, Mass subscribers got to read this a few months back when I did a research brief on it. But you can definitely get access to this paper and dig into the full text if you want. It's a good one. Wolin and colleagues 2024, influence of 8 weeks of supervised static stretching or resistance training of pectoral major muscles on maximal strength, muscle thickness, and range of motion. I don't know how far we want to go out on a limb here, Trex, but I think it is worth talking about the question that many crazy bodybuilders like myself are wondering is, hey, Eric, speculate for me. Do you think this could be potentially beneficial in addition to resistance training, or is it redundant? What's the mechanism here? Do you think that we should give the people what they want, a little bit of speculation?
Yeah, and if I can lob one more irresponsible link or question out in there, a lot of times when we talk about stretch-mediated hypertrophy on the show, we get a lot of questions and follow-up questions about lengthened partials, and people want to know if there is a parallel there or some kind of mechanistic overlap. Are lengthened partials doing what they do because we're kind of in this lengthened, somewhat stretched position for a greater period during the lift? So be as reckless as you'd like within that whole genre of speculative assertions.
Let's do it. And actually, this does actually connect to a question that we recently got in the Facebook group as to isometrics and whether or not isometric training is better than dynamic. So I'll loop that in as well. So first, let me just talk about mechanisms, because I have definitely seen the claim that, hey, and it is true. Like if you read a review paper that was written by Warnicki and colleagues, which I also reviewed in Mass, was our cover story, and you can find freely available to read on Stronger by Science if you're a non-subscriber.
Man, it sounds like Mass is full of really great content. It's like everything you talk about, you've reviewed it in there.
Yeah, and people would be able to get the full in-depth reading of these topics and even more nuance with links to prior issues going all the way back to 2017, Dr. Trexler. I would imagine that if I were the listener to this, I'd be like, you know what? I wish I could pause this so I could go sign up, but it's live and it's so riveting, I don't want to leave. So let me just at least bookmark Mass right now. Do it now, folks. And then after Eric's done talking, I'm going to go sign up.
Well, that's what I would do. You start a monthly subscription, set you back $30, and you get, 7 years worth of content tonight? I mean, that's wild. An irresponsible deal. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, I don't even know how they're making money. So, in all seriousness, I've written about the mechanisms of this, and I was obligated to do so because of some of the chatter around this that I thought was premature and maybe overly reductionist, or too broad in stroke is probably a better way to put it. While it is true that if you read the hypothetical mechanisms behind this, because this is not mechanistic research, it's very much applied. They didn't actually, investigate, pathways and signaling in one group versus the other to see if the way that hypertrophy was produced differed between groups. But they discussed that we think it's tension mediated. And I think people right now, they paint with a very broad brushstroke when they think of tension. It goes all the way back to Schoenfeld's, 2010 2010 paper on mechanisms of hypertrophy. And they go, right, there's tension, there's metabolic stress, there's damage, and that has subsequently changed a lot with understanding the role, the relative influence, and the confidence we have in each one of those being mechanisms, and whether they should actually be thought of as mechanisms in an applied sense that we leverage, or just things that happen in response to resistance training. Whole lot to unpack there. But I think it's resulted in this kind of broad brushstroke of tension is tension. But that's really a reductionist statement. When we actually say, okay, what is progressive tension overload? People start to have a little bit less confidence. Like, okay, so how is tension sensed and developed in a muscle? Does it occur at the whole muscle level or the fiber level? Where? And from my reading, as a non-muscle physiologist, but as someone with related experience and knowledge, there are at least 5 mechanosensors that exist in the muscle tendon unit that could be responsible for or signaling for hypertrophy that are potentially stimulated in different ways. So tension should not be seen as a one-size-fits-all. It must be the same. When you look at some of these mechanosensors, some of them are going to be absolutely stimulated differently by a stretch than a contraction, differently by eccentric versus concentric dominant contractions, and probably by the time spent, and potentially even by the cell swelling that does or doesn't occur in response to training. So stretching and resistance training probably do both have a primary mechanism of inducing growth via tension, but it may very well not be the same type of tension that is sensed. And I think that's an important distinction. And further, anytime we talk about deep physiology like this, we have to acknowledge that there is more that we don't know than what we do know. And just to throw some cool shit out there, and I have my article up on the phone because I couldn't remember it all. Like, there's some of the ones that people talk about relatively frequently as far as mechanosensors, and that is, say, costomeres or focal adhesions, which are responsible for lateral force transmission. They serve the functional role of actually just making sure that force production is more efficient in the muscle, but they also are sensors and they stimulate hypertrophic pathways. And those are probably stimulated by your typical stock standard, contractions. People have probably also heard of titin, which I mentioned earlier, which is what anchors the actin myosin to the actual cytoskeleton in the sarcomere. And when you get an eccentric contraction, it unfolds and lengthens. So, okay, that makes sense. But there's some other wild ways which tension is sensed that I wasn't even aware of. So here's one for you. Nuclear flattening. That the actual nuclei, the myonuclei in the fibers themselves, when the sarcomere is lengthened and tension is provided and it gets a little thinner, the pressure on the nuclei deforms them, and there's actually a signaling response to that. So the nuclei themselves have been theorized to potentially be mechanosensors that could induce hypertrophy. And there's more. There's also stretch-activated channels that are actually in the membrane of the muscle cell that allow calcium flux to occur and result in signaling that way. And there's other ones. There's proteins that I had to look up and make sure I spelled right because I just wasn't even aware of them. And the point being is that we know a small bit about the actual mechanistic underpinnings, the true minute changes at the smallest level of what even induces hypertrophy, let alone one type of hypertrophy stimulated by 2 pretty distinct methods of training. So I think we need to acknowledge that. We're still figuring out the mechanisms. Anyone who speaks very confidently and says things like stretching is only going to produce sarcomeres in series is either not aware of the animal data or for some reason doesn't think it applies. I think it does. Is not aware that we're seeing increases in muscle thickness in the magnitude of 5 to 10%, which you would not see in a rested state if it's just increases in sarcomeres in series in the study that we just talked about by Wolin, as well as the prior data in Warnke. And also, they're not doing a great job of explaining why we're seeing these big strength increases, which is kind of cool. And I think only some of that can be explained by shifting that length-tension relationship to being able to produce more tension at longer lengths, because some of the isometric testing and testing they did were not always necessarily at these extreme muscle lengths. And the types of strength increases to the tune of 10%, I think we're probably seeing some influence of either neuromuscular changes as well as that change in length-tension relationship, or potentially just more contractile tissue, enabling us to produce more force. So there's a lot more going on here. It's pretty neat. And there is certainly some overlap with, say, training at longer muscle lengths, but I wouldn't say it is absolutely the same, right?
Right.
So think about it this way, Trex. We're comparing regular old pec flies and regular old calf raises to stretching and getting similar results. However, we have data comparing regular old calf raises to lengthened partial calf raises, and it's actually one of the clearer magnitudes of effect favoring lengthened partial training, where lengthened partial training, this is a study by Cassiano and colleagues, had substantially more growth than the full range of motion training,
Right.
right?
So
So these are
theoretically
probably
would have had a higher magnitude than stretching alone.
exactly. I would guess, although I
Right.
don't have enough data to be confident in it, if we had the stretching boot versus lengthened partial calf raises, we would see lengthened partials doing even better than the stretch-mediated hypertrophy alone. So there might be an overlap there. It might be that they're both doing something similar, and then you get a little more out of being at a relatively longer muscle length the whole time. Now I'm going to connect the final piece to isometric training, and I would direct people towards a pretty good research review that came out by Oranchuk and colleagues, actually out of AUT. Dustin did his PhD around the same time I was finishing mine, and he did it on isometric training. And there's a lot of different types of isometrics. There's yielding, there's constant, there's pushing, there's pulling, and it's difficult to tell if there are different stimulus from each one of these, and it's difficult to gauge intensity. Holding something until you can no longer hold it and you're seeing a slight change and you stop the exercise is very different from being on a isokinetic dynamometer and setting it up to just do an isometric test where you're pushing against an immovable object, right?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, one of the things that we often say is true because we believe it to be, but we don't have as much data on as we think we do, is that dynamic training is obviously better than isometric training for strength and hypertrophy development. But I'm actually not aware of any human studies comparing the two and looking at morphological and strength changes over time. I found myself believing this, and in one random mass article as a side tangent, I stated, and isometric training is, better than dynamic training. So that tells us something about the MVICs, and we can make some inferences about how EMG isn't perfect representation. And I was like, I should probably put a citation there. And I ended up having to go with a study in rats because that was the only thing I could find. So right now, I'm only aware of animal data suggesting that dynamic training is better than static. And of course, I'm not going to hang my hat too heavily on that. But what we do know is that there are differences in different types of isometric training. And the most consistent finding as it relates to hypertrophy is that isometric training at longer muscle lengths produces substantially higher hypertrophy than isometric training at relatively shorter muscle lengths. Kind of just giving more mechanistic understanding to there is something about being at a relatively longer muscle length and producing tension. It enhances the tension stimulus, and that somehow is influencing the outcome here. So what does that mean? Well, it's tough. Some of the things that are experiential, if you ever try doing one of these extreme stretching protocols, is that you do start to experience something similar to BFR training. You start to get tingles, you start to get occlusion, you start to feel like you're not getting as much blood flow to an area. You get the pins and needles. It's very uncomfortable, and you go through different kind of phases. Because I've personally done this. I've basically replicated the Wernicke protocol in myself, just giving myself 1 day a week off. So I did 6 hours a week in the stretching boot. And the protocol is very painful. It's uncomfortable, and you can't really escape it. And each time you get a little more range of motion, you have to tighten it back down to maintain that 8 out of 10 perceived discomfort. And man, it's interesting. So it could be that we're getting some type of hypoxic environment going on. It could be that the constant nature of that duration. It could be stimulating hyperplasia. That's something that has been observed in the animal data. And I'm not sure that you're getting those same things from doing lengthened partials. Maybe to some degree you're getting a little more occlusion. But I'm not sure why lengthened partials are necessarily better. It is easy to say, look, it's just more tension, right? Because you're in a more lengthened position, and some of the mechanosensors I described would be, getting greater stimulus. But I'm not sure that that's all that's going on, and I'm not sure that even lengthened partials are comparable to a static stretch that's being held. And another really interesting thing, and I'll leave it here with speculative, comments, is that we assume that not only do you have to provide tension to a muscle cell for it to grow, but that it also has to be activated. But I'm not sure that's true. So there's actually some animal data that has been published on stretching where they actually stretched the muscle but de-innervated it. So what does that mean? Is they basically disconnected the nerve to the muscle and stretched it because they wanted to specifically say, hey, look, this isn't them contracting against the stretch stimulus, like we did see in this human study by Wolin and colleagues, that load cell would continually kind of respond to being stretched as like probably a protective mechanism of the joint. And you could speculate, oh, it's that contraction in this highly tense state that's producing the hypertrophy. If we were to believe that the animal data is representative of what might happen in humans, that may not be true, because they saw pretty substantial growth that was comparative to the rest of the animal data on this topic, even in de-innervated muscle that was stretched. So I'm not sure you actually need to activate and actually send a neuromuscular signal to a muscle for it to hypertrophy. That could be true, or it could have some kind of influence, but we're not sure. So a lot of the stretching time period when you're in a stretch is not under active contraction, or at least not a high magnitude of it, and we're still seeing these comparable increases in hypertrophy. So I think this is really cool. In many ways, to me, it parallels BFR, because BFR, we're having to ask ourselves questions about, well, does this tell us about metabolic stress, or is it just inducing a state where we're not as effective at buffering fatigue, so other fibers have to come into play, so it's just accelerating tension. The same people who will say that it's just tension, stretching is the same as resistance training, are typically the same people who are saying, listen, metabolic stress is not a pathway to hypertrophy, BFR is just accelerating tension. And that is certainly plausible, but there are some chinks in the armor there. There are a few studies where they apply BFR in the absence of resistance training, like post-workout, or when they add lactate to a muscle cell, in vitro, and we see hypertrophy in response to it. Of course, that's a highly limited, situation and not necessarily applicable to in vivo research. But I think we need to maintain an open mind to the fact, or to the likelihood, that both metabolic stress and something that's going on with stretching provides some type of stimulus that could differ from resistance training and could provide novel, potentially complementary pathways to hypertrophy than what we see from resistance training. And just kind of doing the whole "it's all tension, bro," I get it. It's appealing. Simple explanations of complex phenomenon are what humans crave, and it makes the decisions that you make in the gym very easy. It's nice to have models that are explanatory, but I think we need to make sure that any model we're operating off of, if we want to call it a model, actually fits the data we have, and that we're confident that that's actually what we're going to observe in the real world. And we're nowhere near close to really having a true model of understanding hypertrophy and all the various ways we can induce it. So I would just say, finally, being very redundant in the way I talk about this, stay open-minded. We don't know if the type of tension that is induced by stretching is the same as that induced by resistance training, and there may be other effects, say secondary effects due to that extreme stretch position related to hypoxia or other potential impacts as well.
Good stuff. I want to share one reflection and one little science history lesson here that relates to everything you just said, or some of what you just said. First of all, I think you did a great job talking through some of those mechanisms. And one of the things that really struck me as you were doing that was it's complicated. And, a lot of the stuff that you were mentioning in terms of all these different mechanoreceptors, I don't know the dates on the papers that you were referring to there, but I mean, was that stuff even known when I was finishing my undergrad degree in like 2013?
Yeah, some of it was, some of it was not. So there is a mixture of papers that I cited that spanned from relatively recently. There was a really good review paper in 2020 by Nunez and colleagues, so Stretch Training Induced Muscle Hypertrophy in Humans, a review of the literature. However, there were other papers going back into the 90s, 2004, 2011. Like knowing about Costamirs and Titan is relatively recent, but us knowing their existence and understanding what they do and what functions they serve are two different things.
Right. Yeah.
I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that kind of struck me as you were talking, I think in your kind of more speculative section, you did a good job doing the "I don't know" sandwich, where you start by saying, "No, I'm not sure about this," and then you do some responsible speculation, and then end with, "And again, I'm not sure about this." I
Right.
think in the fitness world, we get kind of desensitized to the hubris of just really reckless mechanistic speculation. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that the folks who participate in scientific research to some degree seem to be way more cautious about layering all those caveats. And I think as listeners, it's really important to kind of put your guard up because, like you were talking about with tension, like when you start digging into like the nitty gritty research, you start to see this stuff is really complicated. And for every extra layer of complication, it makes it harder and harder to speculate about a practical kind of applied strategy based on a mechanism. The more layers of complication there are, the more possibility is that your extrapolation of that mechanism is not going to pan out in the real world. There are things in there that behave in ways you didn't anticipate, maybe things we haven't even discovered yet. Getting from point A to point V, or X, there's so many steps in there. I think it's really important to reinforce, even for something as simple, which, like, for as long as we've known that muscles exist and how they work in a very general sense, all that complicated stuff that's unresolved is about what happens when a muscle gets kind of long. That's like a basic thing of muscles are either getting longer or shorter when they move, right? And the fact that we're still trying to unravel the complexities of that should give you a lot of pause when someone says, "Hey, I built a new training program based on this, like, one or two little mechanistic studies. I'm sure this is going to pan out just fine." 9 times out of 10, I'd say that it's probably not going to happen. The other thing I wanted to mention, so you way back at the beginning, you talked about replication and the fact that replication is not just important because we think people are lying. There are other reasons why replication matters. And you mentioned sampling error, the fact that, you get 12 people in a study, who knows if they really represent the global population well, right? But theoretically, the same group could get over that by doing repeated sampling and doing larger
Mm-hmm.
samples, right? But the reason that we like independent replication of other labs, there's a number of things. Some people might have been wondering, what are some examples of why we need that if it's not them lying? One thing would be sometimes there is variation in equipment or
Mm-hmm.
instrumentation. The stuff that people use on one side of the world might be different than the stuff they use on the other side of the world. You might find that there's an unexpected fluke where certain equipment is leading to a particular finding. Hopefully not, but that can be the case. Same thing goes with availability of research materials. Maybe we find that they're studying a supplement and there's massive differences in the, purity over here versus over there. It could be the subject population. Maybe there are innate characteristics of, people on that side of the world versus this side of the world that is causing meaningful differences in the type of effect that is observed. And then the final point is a little bit of the history lesson that I alluded to. There was a dude, this is like the classic replication example, way back in the day who had a horse named Clever Hans. So there was an investigation in 1907. This guy said, "Trust me, I'm certain that my horse can do some pretty impressive arithmetic." I think, addition, subtraction, maybe even multiplication and division, could spell some words. And so basically the trainer would tell it to, hey, what's, 2 times 3? And it would just, pound its foot on the dirt 6 times, right? So this guy was like, "Dude, I'm telling you, this horse, he's doing all this different stuff. He's, doing all this stuff well." And he could actually demonstrate to folks like, yeah, you want it, what do you want? 4 times 2, here we go. And it would, 8 times. And so they did this investigation and they found that the horse could do math when it was instructed by the owner, but when anyone else would try to take it away from the owner and do these math problems, it couldn't do a damn thing. And so what they were finding out was that the horse was just extremely perceptive and was responding to kind of nonverbal anticipatory gestures that the owner of the horse was not meaning to do, but the horse could just kind of tell by body language and the general vibe of the trainer, "Oh, he wants me to go again. Okay, he wants me to go again. Oh, it looks like I should stop." So it was a really interesting situation where there are expectancy effects
Mm.
from the direction of the observer to the subject that actually meaningfully impacted the results of that kind of mini silly experiment of whether or not this horse could actually do math. But it's a great example of like, why do you want an independent replication? Who knows what the hell is going on in the lab? Maybe through no fault of the researcher, they're putting out vibes that are kind of subtly encouraging the participant to rack that bar a few reps early, right? You just never know, right? And that's why replication can be such an important tool in research. So sometimes I like to lean on those fun little history lessons because early science I think is just fascinating. It's like the problems were the same, but they're just the best stories, man.
100%. I love it. So the guy's sitting there like, yep, he's still tapping his hoof. Yep. Is he going to get to 15? Oh my God, he got to 15. The horse is like,
Exactly.
oh, so that one. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Yeah. So the horse is like, I'm not a dumbass. I know what you want. I can
Yeah.
see you.
How do I
But
get a carrot? Yeah.
yeah, but apparently the story goes that the human had no idea that he was giving off such strong vibes of exactly what he was hoping to see. But yeah, you got to be careful out there in the research game. All right, Helms, I'm really stoked because we had a comment from Darren, Dr. Darren, in the live chat here. He mentioned that he's currently on a lifting restriction of 10 pounds until May, has a lot of limitations in terms of posture and load lifting, and he's stoked about maybe implementing some of this stretch-related research, the stretch-mediated hypertrophy work. So that to me sounds like a great example of a situation where it would probably come into it could turn out to be quite helpful as long as it's medically approved by the doctor and everything. So yeah, it's probably not, we made a few cracks about how it's certainly not a pleasant experience, but sometimes it's, the most viable training method available. And so, hey, glad to see that
Certainly
it might be
more
helpful.
pleasant than atrophy. Am I right?
Absolutely. 100%. So speaking of the live chat, let's dive in and answer a few questions here.
Let's
We've
go.
got a question from N Wings. Do you have any advice for people who seem to get sick every time they start to get some consistency going in the gym? So they're saying, assuming that overtraining and underlying health issues are not the reason, it sounds like they're just kind of discouraged. Every time they start to get some momentum, they get sick, they have some detraining, and they feel like they're kind of spinning their wheels. So what kind of advice would you give?
Yeah, there's gradations of sick, um, and there are some not great data, kind of associational, as I recall. I don't have it off the top of my head. I can't cite anything in athletes where the distinction between a upper respiratory tract infection or just a cold, kind of the old wives' tale that maybe isn't an old wives' tale of listen, if you just got the sniffles and you feel it in your throat, you can go out and do things, but once it's progressed to an upper respiratory tract infection, maybe you shouldn't go to the gym. Might actually be true. So the first thing I would say is there is such a thing as making things worse by going to the gym when you're ill. But there is probably something to say of you're a little more resilient than you think you are. And if you've got a mild cold, you should wear a mask, should probably exercise on your own at home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Don't put other people at risk. But if you can safely for other people exercise in the presence of a very mild illness, that may open up some more options for you. And I can't know, based on this question, whether this person is experiencing like mono,
Yeah.
on a semi-regular basis, or whether they maybe are hyper aware of any type of sniffle or illness or something that could even potentially be allergies, and they're going, you know what, let me just not make this worse. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is if you're getting ill with this level of frequency, I would go talk to your doctor and maybe just get a checkup and just see what's going on. Because, I was talking to someone recently who's experiencing a long COVID. I've talked to other people who ended up finding out they had a latent autoimmune issue. There's a wild, wacky cornucopia of things that could be leading you to being sick regularly. And some of them might be diagnosable and potentially curable, or at least you can get more informed about it. So I would just recommend you actually go speak to your GP.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. It's always a good idea to check that out. I do know that like I've had friends who have young kids who go to daycare, and like I mean they're perpetually sick from the from the
Hmm.
time their kid's like 6 months old to like 3, you know. So there are some folks who are just kind of like consistently getting these kind of really minor, you know, colds and flu type things. I agree with your perspective. Like the way it's been explained to me many times before is kind of, are you experiencing things above the neck or below the neck? You know, if you've got like a chest cold and you feel it in your lungs, and or if it's like a systemic thing and you've got a fever, probably want to lay off. You know, if it's sniffles, you know, maybe a slight cough, you know, maybe like you said, maybe there are responsible ways to continue doing some kind of exercise. Maybe even incorporating some of the less arduous exercise, maybe doing isometrics, doing some band work at home, doing some lengthened partial stuff. You know, if you don't feel like, you know, low volume lengthened partial stuff, if you feel like just saying, hey, I want to get the most bang for my buck, low volume, get in, get out. So maybe there's ways to kind of do some of these other types of training. But I think the only other thing I would add to that is detraining. To get meaningful detraining that's going to wipe several weeks or even months of training off the board. It's going to usually require two things: a pretty notable level of inactivity or a pretty long time out of the
Hmm.
gym, right? It's not like being sick for a week, you know, unless you're like bedridden, right? Which you could be. I don't know from the comment, but if we're only talking about being out of the gym for a week or two, it has to be a pretty extreme level of inactivity to wipe a lot of gains off the board. So that's one other thing I would encourage you to think of in terms of just your perspective on how much detraining is really occurring. You know, if it's only a week or two here where you're just kind of still walking around and doing day-to-day stuff, but you're just not able to get into the gym, there is some possibility that there's not as much detraining happening as you might think. So that's something to consider as well.
And the last thing I'd add to that is if there is substantial detraining, muscle memory is absolutely a thing.
Hmm.
And the rate at which those gains will return are factors faster than what it took to get them in the first place. And we actually do have a pretty good article that we wrote during or after COVID. Mike Zerdos wrote it, and it's freely available on Stronger by Science. It was initially in Mass. And again, subscribers already have read this. But it's all about how to responsibly and not too quickly get all those gains back on the table and return to the gym in full force. So yeah, I would highly encourage people to check that out if they do unfortunately find themselves in a place where they've experienced detraining.
Yep, definitely. Quick one here from Artzilla. Art was asking, is there any research on if incorporating a mindfulness practice into your lifestyle has any benefits towards strength and physique goals? Ignore the meditation bowls that you see behind my head right now. There's no bias whatsoever here. So mindfulness, you know, there's a lot of different ways to implement it. Kind of the most common way is with mindfulness meditation, which in and of itself can take many forms. But this is yet another topic that we have reviewed inside the Mass Research Review back in Volume 6, Issue 9. And my article was called, Does Mindfulness Have a Place in Fitness? And the conclusion was tentatively, maybe. You know, there is a surprisingly large number of meta-analyses looking at, you know, different applications of mindfulness in what I would call things that are at least tangentially related to fitness. So there are several meta-analyses and even umbrella reviews that are kind of meta looks at several meta-analyses, but I would say the most direct applications that have substantial research support for mindfulness practice would relate to eating behaviors, pain management, sleep, and mental fatigue. So, you know, the idea that you can improve your eating behaviors by implementing some type of mindful eating intervention with a mindfulness practice attached to it. So kind of reframing mentally some of those kind of conditioned responses to different food stimuli and eating experiences. Managing pain, you know, as the biopsychosocial model of pain gets more and more support within the kind of neuroscience community and the community of practitioners in the applied health sciences. You know, it becomes very clear that the way we think about pain, the narratives that we build around pain, can have a huge impact on the way we experience it. You know, and that's not to say it's all in your head. It's just to say that pain, of course, there are biological elements, but there are also psychological and social elements. And, for example, if you spend your whole day worrying about pain and going over these narratives subconsciously that you're broken and you're going to be broken until somebody cuts you up and fixes you, in surgery, and you surround yourself with folks who are also kind of, it kills me. A few powerlifters will get together and all of a sudden it's like a session of everyone just saying, oh, my shoulder and oh, my back and oh, my knee. And all of a sudden everyone's in more pain, right? Like there are these subtle things that can kind of influence the way we experience pain because there are psychological and even emotional elements of a pain experience. So mindfulness has a very clear role there. Mindfulness can help a lot with sleep issues. Not all sleep issues. There are some, medical sleep disorders that, you're not going to be able to meditate your way through it. You're going to need some actual medical intervention. But for many instances of folks who are struggling to get to sleep at night, mindfulness can be very helpful. And then mental fatigue. Mike Zordos in the Mass Research Review has covered mental fatigue several times. There have been some acute studies indicating that they can basically get people to perform worse by just putting a lot on their plate mentally, giving them a big cognitive load, shortly before they enter the gym, having them do, any kind of like stressful or cognitively demanding task that's purely mental, can really fatigue them. And unfortunately, there's even some studies showing that just being a little bit too glued to your smartphone between sets might also have a mentally fatiguing effect that could impact performance acutely. And there's some research indicating that a kind of restful, restorative, short mindfulness practice before you exercise, if you're someone who, this is super practical because a lot of people go to the gym after a long day of schoolwork or a long day of occupational work, and you've been doing cognitively demanding tasks or frustrating tasks or, tedious tasks all day. Taking that 15 or 20 minutes to do a mindfulness practice and kind of center yourself and calm down and recharge a little bit may be able to help out with some of that mental fatigue and overcome the negative effects of mental fatigue on acute performance. So those are the areas where I think there are, kind of the strongest bodies of evidence. Like I said, there are a surprisingly high number of studies in those individual areas, even a pretty decent number of meta-analyses. But I will acknowledge that a lot of folks have come out, in the kind of meta-science world who have said, hey, some of this research pertaining to mindfulness, has a high risk of bias, maybe not the most rigorously done body of research. And you do see that sometimes. Sometimes there are areas of research where just the general way of doing things is not really caught up to the highest level of evidence yet, or, the highest, most rigorous standards of how we do science. And that happens because different fields kind of mature in terms of their methodology at different rates. So there's no question that there are some pretty substantial limitations to a lot of the mindfulness research out there, but nonetheless, it's an area where there is, a growing body of literature which does have relatively higher risk of bias, but there's evidence to lean on there nonetheless that can be quite insightful. So I think mindfulness absolutely can have a place in fitness, but as is the case with anything, I think one of the things that may actually lead to slightly, some underestimation of the impact of mindfulness is, my personal belief as someone who has done it and has looked at the literature. I think mindfulness will only work under two conditions. Number one, you have to do it effectively, right? So you could put someone through a mindfulness exercise. Let's say it's an audio tape, right? If they're just sitting there with their arm folded going, I can't believe I'm wasting 20 minutes on this, and they're not really engaged in it, it seems very unlikely to me that it would do anything at all other than frustrate them and be very tedious and annoying. So I think mindfulness is one of those things where the practice itself has to be implemented effectively, and also there, I think, probably needs to be some degree of participant buy-in, which is a bit of a cop-out in terms of how we normally look at interventions, where it's like, oh yeah, it only works if you believe in it. Well, then you're just saying, hey, here's a placebo, basically. But I do think that mindfulness kind of requires a level of buy-in to mentally engage in it in a way that's really hard to do if you're not at least open to it working. And I know for some people that may feel like a lack of scientific rigor, but I think it is a unique intervention where if the work that you're doing is cognitive in nature, you have to be invested in actually doing that cognitive work for the intervention to really have happened. Aside, it's different to say you engaged in a mindfulness practice versus I sit here with headphones on for 20 minutes and waited for them to stop talking, right? Those are two very, very different things. So yeah, the mindfulness research, it's very difficult to do for that reason. I think there is a level of buy-in that's kind of necessary for it to really have a chance at being effective. What do you think, Helms?
Well, I'll just give the unbiased, non-big enlightenment payoff perspective here. Um, Even if you do find the threats to bias or internal validity of some of the research on mindfulness directly, I think the very compelling data on mental fatigue is essentially establishing the inverse, right? Which is saying that the inverse of mindfulness, being distracted and not being centered, reliably reduces performance in various exercise metrics, and that other things which would achieve the same intended outcome of mindfulness, attentional focus strategies, biofeedback. So, for example, knowledge of velocity, being told to maximally, exert force into the bar, being given visual feedback. There's a lot of research on feedback and attentional focus, external focus, for example, that does improve performance. And all of these, while they do different things, they all do one similar thing, which is make sure that you are being mindful of something, and that's specifically an aspect of your performance, and that you're present. I think anyone who's been in the game a long time, let's say you're doing a set of 20, on the first 5 or 6 reps, you might just be going through the motions because you don't need to be exerting that hard against a 60% of 1 RM load. And, I'm not saying that being able to be present for those first 5 or 6 reps in that specific context is really, really important. But there is gradations of the level of attentional focus you can bring. And when we experimentally try to make it harder for someone to bring that attentional focus, or we experimentally try to enhance that attentional focus, we do see improvements in performance. So while that's not directly on mindfulness, I think it does give hint to there should be a theoretical rationale of why it does improve things.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Helms, we got a handful of questions. I want to make sure we get to as many as we can. So I think maybe we'll just have one person answer each question and try to keep them concise and knock them out here. So there was a question here by Magnus for a recreational lifter who wants to stay lean year round, around 10 to 15% body fat. How would you set up bulks and cuts? Or would you just mainly train at maintenance and just kind of, maintain and hope that you're going to kind of improve body composition over time? What I would do is I would train basically at maintenance or just ever so slightly in a surplus for as long as I could and squeeze all the gains out of that I could. If I felt like I had gotten to a point where I was pretty well trained and it seemed like I was really unable to really move the needle in terms of making progress without a more sizable caloric surplus, then I would start doing bulking and cutting phases. And if that was the range I wanted to work in, 10 to 15% body fat, I would probably, let's say I'm starting out on the lower end of that range, I would probably say, okay, I'm going to bulk up to about 15% body fat, and I'm going to do that over the next maybe 9 months, right? So I would take a nice slow bulk, maybe in the 9-month time frame, get up to that 15% and say, okay, now time for a cut. I'm going to get down into that 10 to 12% range, and I'm going to do that over 6 months, right? Because I like to take those phases nice and slowly, just to make sure that I'm, you're playing with fire when you start to get really rapid back and forth with the cutting and bulking, in my opinion. A bulk that's too fast likely invites an excessive degree of fat gain. A cut that is too fast likely invites an excessive degree of muscle loss. So I would say I would kind of, those aren't rules. Those are just kind of heuristics, kind of my general preferences. But I would say when you're bulking, give it a good 9 to 12 months. And when you're cutting, give it a good 6 months and kind of oscillate back and forth that way. That's kind of how I would do it. Helms, do you have anything to add to that?
I think in that specific example, the only thing I would say is that you could probably cut faster than 6 months, just because I think generally I agree with you, but I think you can probably you can make a 5% reduction in body fat faster than 6 months, following what would be very reasonable deficits.
Yeah.
So
So maybe
yeah,
3 to 6.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
I think you're not really talking about mini cuts at that point. Um, you know, we're
Yeah.
talking about an extended bulking phase and an extended cutting phase, which is perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Cool. All right. I got a question for you here. Can you please talk about natural limits and how we can be sure if we're already there? So, for example, I've been lifting for 25 years and I'm not making significant progress right now. So, how do you kind of address whether or not someone's at their natural limit? And then probably a follow-up question, then what?
Yeah, they probably exist in practice, but not principle. I know that sounds weird, but what we're talking about is an asymptote, where you probably could stimulate some degree of gains with some protocol, but the amount of progress you would be able to actually see would be not visible. It would be, in the order of grams, and it might take a very long period of time or an unsustainable level of effort or fatigue or something like that. Um, but it is nigh impossible to know if you're actually there until you have really turned over a ton of stones and seen nothing to pay for it. And I'll give you a personal example. In May, so in 2 months, I will not be quite as experienced as this question actually I'll ask her, but I'll be at my 20-year mark. And I am seeing currently, and I'm also turning 41 next month, something not quite as dramatic, but akin to my newbie gains. And for me, what caused that and what is causing that currently and what I'm experiencing was that I fully committed to bodybuilding. I stepped away from powerlifting, and I increased my volume. I started training closer to failure, and I also started doing a lot more exercises that put greater tensions at longer muscle lengths, while also removing some of the fatigue and just logistical constraints of trying to also be a good powerlifter at the same time. And then also maintaining the same kind of structure of recovery and nutrition around those behaviors to foster a good environment for growth. And I've got data that makes me very confident that I'm actually making pretty crazy gains, like sum of 8 skin folds, my current body weight, strength gains, visual changes, and confirmed by like my coach Brian Miner, who's giving me good feedback. So to me, that tells me that I had hit maybe something close to my natural limit if my goal was to be the best combined strength and physique athlete who was unwilling to fully commit to specializing. But then once I did something that was quite novel, for some muscle groups, we're talking 40 to 50% increase in volume. And for my overall quote unquote intensity, being 1 to 2 reps closer to failure, and then swapping out many exercises for other exercises that are arguably more efficient and more stimulative. So that was a pretty large overhaul to what I was doing. And all of a sudden, I realized that maybe I'm not as close to my natural limit as I thought. But there's another reality, or maybe just it's 2 years from now, where I try a similar degree of change and novelty and put in a lot of effort. I'm training hard right now, and I don't get bigger. So that's going to have to happen at some point, but you can't know until after the fact. And I don't know how useful some of the predictions are based upon population norms. Because if we look at, say, something like a fat-free mass index, or if we get old school, and you might be aware of this if you've been lifting for 25 years, and we look at, Casey Butt's calculations based upon pre-steroid era, bodybuilding champions in combination with some of the WMBF world champions, and go, hey, how big were these guys able to get based upon their wrist and ankle circumferences and anthropometrics? Like that tells you an observation. It doesn't tell you a prediction. Yes, the biggest guys in the world can get this big relative to their ankle measurements. Not anyone can get as big as the biggest guys in the world in a relative proportionate manner to their circumferences. So I think those can be used as like hopeful metrics of maybe where I could get to if I happen to have the genetics of, a Brian Whitaker or, a Reg Park or something like that. But you probably don't, or maybe you have better for all you know, right? So it is very challenging to say. And other metrics, when we move along from that are even less individual, like fat-free mass index, is a complete crapshoot as far as how it applies to an individual. All you have to do is have a cursory understanding of what a standard deviation is to get that looking at some mean in a 86-person study of a random gym in LA doesn't tell you like what the upper limit of fat-free mass index is, and then where you sit on that bell curve distribution, which we have no idea, right? So I think the old adage of, you know what, you're never going to know your genetics, so just work as hard as you can, and when you get there, you'll know it. That is something I would absolutely tell someone who's training for 5 years and ask this question. For someone who's training 25 years, I think the answer to your question is the same one I'd answer myself. Look in the mirror and ask myself, have I been relatively conservative and not willing to go out on a limb and gamble and risk? And have I just been kind of, sweeping the floor over and over again to the same degree? Am I doing what I've always done because I've gotten comfortable and I like what my training is? Am I repeating the same leg workout I did 10 years ago? Or have I sat down and maybe included someone I trust who's smart with a lot of experience to collaborate with me and say, hey, I want to objectively look at what I'm doing, how far I've gone, where I'm at, and what do we think, if there is a possibility that I can make more gains, how do we stack all the chips in my favor, and then let's give it a good college try. And if you've done that and you've gone back to the drawing board 3, 4, 5, 6 times over the period of multiple years, and you're still not making quantitative improvements, you're probably at your limit. But that's the kind of thing that you would have to do to find that out. And I will finally say, that's actually really fun. I think someone could frame what I talked about in kind of nihilistic terms, like, wow, I have to put in years of hard effort just to find out I didn't make any gains. To me, it's like, it's a puzzle, it's a challenge. And if you don't enjoy the process of lifting and trying to figure out how you can succeed in the face of very challenging odds and work really, really hard to get marginal gains, then you're never going to have this problem in the first place because you don't actually love lifting. You don't love the intellectual process, the figuring out process, the artistic process. You're doing it to get an outcome. And ironically, and we actually have data on this from motivational work, that if you're purely focused on the outcome of getting to a goal and not the process of it, you're less likely to achieve that goal anyway. So if this sounds intimidating to you, don't worry. This is never going to be a problem for you in the first place.
Yeah. A related question, I kind of piggyback on that. Giacomo asked, do you think it's possible to train hard for several years with deloads when appropriate, or is there a necessity for extended maintenance training periods? My 2 cents, I would say, in theory, yeah, you can train hard for several years, take deloads when you need them. You don't need to intentionally go out and have an extended training period where you kind of commit to just maintaining. So in theory, absolutely it's possible. In practice, you're probably going to have setbacks. You're probably going to have periods of time where you plateau for more than a couple weeks at a time. So you'll end up in situations where you say, oh, I will look back and say the last 10 weeks of training were a maintenance period because I haven't really gotten anywhere. But Helms, what do you think?
Yeah, I think if we take a very liberal definition of what a deload is, the answer in practice is no, it's probably not possible. But I agree with you. I'll give you a personal example. This new training protocol I'm doing is very hard. It induces mental fatigue. My DOM subsides just on time. And I did actually incur a minor hamstring strain in like week 5 or 6 of this new program, which recovered within days. In response to that minor hamstring strain, it also coincided with when I went to France for my anniversary with my wife. So I trained differently and shorter and essentially did a deload that I probably would have done anyway because I was on vacation that happened to coincide with a minor strain. And the reason I bring up the strain and the travel is that My indicators prior to that point, of which I use and practice as a coach for when someone needs to deload, had not yet triggered the idea that I needed to deload. I was still progressing in the gym, and kind of our sports science definition of when you are overreached and when you therefore may need to do something about your fatigue is when performance is going down. Unfortunately, sports science is a broad concept that applies to all sports, and I think that probably works really well for endurance training. But for resistance training, when we're looking at primarily strength and strength endurance metrics, I'll put it this way, force production is one of the last things to go from overtraining. You can be at a point where you have low motivation to train, pain, disrupted sleep, a different endocrine profile, and you're ready to break at any moment, but you may still be able to produce something that's within the margin of error of your normal force production. So we can't use the only metric of when we need to deload as, oh, are my loads going down? Or am I unable to get the same number of reps at a given load? I think you have to be more subjectively aware because, case in point, I strained my hamstring on the fourth set of RDLs, and the first 3 sets were lifetime PRs. So it's like, you don't need a deload. You're clearly performing better. You find the right balance between stress and recovery. You got hurt. Like, okay,
Yeah.
clearly, technically, if I had deloaded and I would have done one less set, I wouldn't have got hurt in that session. Now, who knows? Maybe that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, and I would have hurt myself bending over to pick up socks the next day. But the point is there's no real clear-cut rules on this, and we don't have nearly enough applied data on deloads. But ultimately, if fatigue accumulates, mental, physical, or otherwise, or injury risk, and I think there's reason to believe at least some of those might, if you're training hard enough, you will need to do something about it. But it could be as simple as taking a day off or swapping out squats because your knee hurts for a leg press one day. And if you take a liberal definition and consider all of those deloads, then yeah, you're going to have to deload. If you don't consider those deloads, then yeah, you don't have to.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right. I'm going to answer a couple ones really quick here. Just jump in if you want to add anything to my answers here. Ben asked, how often do you see students in graduate programs come from fields outside of exercise science? I'm a business undergrad, but love exercise. Ben, I think that some of the best work in our field comes from people who are trained in other fields. And I think that happens all the time because now that I've entered a new field where I'm the only exercise nutrition person, it's been really fun to see the questions that stump the people around me and I'm able to solve and be like, hey, yeah, we deal with that question all the time where I come from, where I got trained. And of course, the opposite is true far more often where I'm like, what do we do here? And they're like, you don't know that? Like, that's like basic for us. So when people from different backgrounds get together, I think that's when a lot of the magic happens in research. And a good example of that is one of the folks who's really seen as kind of like a big name in exercise research, Bill Kramer. His PhD is not in exercise science. The individual who is behind not just beta-alanine, but also creatine, Roger Harris, his PhD is not in nutrition or exercise science. So some of the kind of biggest names that have kind of founded, the fields of strength and conditioning and the field of sports nutrition, they are not people who are trained in strength and conditioning or sports nutrition, at least not for their PhD. So it can be, I would highly encourage people. I would say, hey, if you're going to do an undergrad, a master's, and a PhD, I mean, all of mine were in the same field, but if I could do it all over again, I would say, hey, get some breadth, stretch out a little bit, do one of those degrees in a different field. I think it's always a good thing. So, I wouldn't be discouraged at all. You'll probably need to take some prereqs to get into a graduate program, but once you get there, you may find that other folks are able to solve certain problems easier than you are, but you might find that you have some unique ability to kind of address blind spots that everybody else has because they were all trained the same way. Another question from POC Angel. They asked, basically, the short version of their question is, I want to get my arms bigger. What should I do? When I want to focus in on a muscle group, what I usually do is I try to get pretty aggressive on focusing with kind of higher volume for that muscle group. And usually the only way to do that efficiently and smartly is by increasing my frequency of how I train that muscle group. So if I want to really grow my pecs, I usually train my pecs 4 days a week. with pretty decent volume per session. If I wanted to grow my arms, I would probably, just so I didn't go crazy because of all the time it takes, I'd probably do a lot of antagonist supersets with biceps and triceps. And I'd probably be hitting my arms for a good, a pretty substantial volume session at least 3 or 4 times a week. Probably 3 or 4 is where I would start and then kind of titrate up or down from there. Helms, how do you feel about that?
I think, yeah, that's good advice. A couple things to consider when you are trying to bring up a specific muscle group for anyone who's thinking other muscle groups. If you're going to do multiple large muscle groups at the same time, you might want to consider putting everything else on maintenance. Don't really need to do that with arms, in my opinion. Some typical practical constraints that do happen with arms is that when you're approaching these high volumes, sometimes you can get tendonitis. So do have some exit strategies or even some preventative strategies, such as doing more neutral grip work, potentially staying in slightly higher rep ranges, but not ultra high rep ranges where your form gets sloppy, and be willing to implement something like BFR when you start to see first warning signs of mild tendonitis, and then go to high volumes relative from where you are, not what other people consider higher volumes. So I would probably assess how many current sets you're doing on arms, and then apples to apples comparison. So thinking about indirect and direct work. When you increase volume, probably do something to the tune of, say, 20%, 30% at most, and then hang there for a couple weeks. And if you're tolerating it well, loads are progressing, you're not getting elbow tendonitis, then you can make another 10% increase, another 10% increase, maybe trying to get to something that ultimately, eventually, is like a 50 to 60% increase in volume, but that's done over multiple months.
All right, good stuff. Let's see.
Last thing I would say also, make sure the exercises you're using are effective. There's a lot of crappy arm exercises out there like tricep kickbacks with a free weight, and a few others. So I would probably favor, is a real simple heuristic, more cable work. So it has a more even resistance curve. So you're always getting tension at various parts of the movement, and use a full range of motion so you're getting that bottom lengthened position. And then don't start sacrificing proximity to failure to get the volume. You still do want them to be effective.
Good stuff. This is a bummer. We have more questions than we have time for, but I think I've got 3 picked out that I'd like us to address. So Let's quick ones that I want you to address, and then one quick one for me. First one for you. Let's see. Ramadan just started. What kind of advice do you have for someone who is participating, observing Ramadan, and they're trying to go down from 12% body fat to 8% body fat?
That's a great question. So I actually, I wish I could pull it up faster if I'd known this was coming. I reviewed an article in Mass on Ramadan, which actually was some of the empirical, actually, Trex, I'm going to punt. You answer one of your questions. I'm going to pull up this Mass article on Ramadan because I want to get it right, because there is some good actionable information in there, and I don't want to incorrectly represent it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So the quick one I was going to address, someone had asked, let me find the exact wording here. Basically, what can I do to get better sleep, to improve sleep quality? And I love that question because it's one of the ones where you can actually do a lot of very practical, completely free things that meaningfully make a difference. So the key word here is sleep hygiene. If you want to improve your sleep quantity or quality, there are a number of things you can do. And I actually reviewed a study that did a sleep hygiene intervention to see how it would help out. There are some studies indicating that, getting better sleep can help with, losing a higher proportion of fat rather than muscle while cutting, losing more fat. Some evidence indicating it can help with performance and muscle building. So sleep is something that you really want to prioritize if you can. I will acknowledge it's a privilege to be able to prioritize sleep. There's no question about that. But if you can, man, it's great because you feel better and it's good for your performance and it's good for everything. So sleep hygiene, a quick rundown of the sleep hygiene intervention in the study I reviewed in Mass. Keep it dark, quiet, and cool in the room where you sleep. Go to bed and get up at the same time every day, including weekends. Go to bed at a time that gives you 8 hours of time in bed. It's okay if you don't sleep the whole 8 hours, but spend 8 hours in bed at least, resting. 2 hours before bed, turn down the lights, put away any screens or mobile phones. or at the very least use a blue light filter and kind of dim your screens to the extent possible. No exercise within 2 hours of bed. No food, coffee, or black tea, or anything with caffeine 2 hours before bed. And caffeine, I would say, cut it out maybe even as many as 10 or 12 hours before bed, personally. Do things that are like calm, positive. You don't want to do anything that's kind of distressing or kind of going to cause a state of arousal, I would say, within a couple hours before bed. When you wake up in the morning, try to get as much natural light as you can. That's an evidence-based strategy. Like I said, caffeine, avoid that, at least 6 hours before bed, preferably 10 to 12 hours. Try to get enough sleep so that you don't really need an alarm clock to wake up. You should still set it so you get to work on time. That's a practical tip. But, if you find that waking up is really just brutal and you're setting multiple alarms, that's probably an indicator that you don't need more mental toughness. You need to kind of revise how you're approaching sleep. Don't use electronic devices that emit light when you're in bed, and learn a relaxation technique such as a mindfulness meditation exercise or something similar, and use it to fall asleep at night, or use it if you wake up at night and you're trying to get back to sleep. And one thing I'll add on there, something that I found really helpful in some of the mindfulness-based content areas. There's a great book by Thich Nhat Hanh where Thich Nhat Hanh talks a lot about rest and just resting for its own sake, and kind of viewing rest itself as being restorative and something that's very rejuvenating. And so a lot of folks, they will wake up in the middle of the night and try to get back to bed. And they're like straining to get back to bed, and it's a stressful thing. And they start to get anxious about, why am I not asleep yet? And it's counterproductive. It makes it harder to fall back asleep when you are actively trying to fall asleep. An alternative way to view that is, if you wake up in the middle of the night, just try to enjoy non-sleep rest. Just lay in bed and try to enjoy the act of resting, even if it's not sleep. And what I find is when I do that, I fall asleep immediately. It's a really calming, very peaceful way to kind of ease yourself back to sleep. So there are very practical things you can do to increase sleep quality and quantity. That's the kind of short list, and you can kind of expand out from there. Helms, Ramadan, what do you got?
Let's do it. Yeah, this is a great question. Good timing, obviously, because Ramadan is coming. And I wanted to pull up this study that I reviewed in Mass back last year by Trichy and colleagues, timing of resistance training during Ramadan fasting and its effects on muscle strength and hypertrophy. And I also wanted to bring in a lot of the work that we've both done on time-restricted feeding, because it has a lot of indirect applications to Ramadan. And I would say some encouraging findings on the whole, because we've kind of gotten the checklist of what is going to make the most out of training in a fasted state. And they are basically training in the fed state, which this study supports, consuming sufficient protein, around 1.6 grams per kg is a decent heuristic cutoff, which of course doesn't mean you're going to lose all your gains if you're below that, or that you can't go above it, but it's a decent line in the sand. And the specific case of Ramadan is a little bit challenging because depending upon where you live in the world and when sun up and sundown is, the fast can be anywhere from 12 to 20 hours. If you're in somewhere where it's darker for longer, it makes it a little more challenging, but basically you're getting two meals, right? You're getting one early in the morning before the sun comes up, typically between 4 to 6 a.m., and then you're getting another one once the sun goes down. And in this specific study, the group that actually trained in the fed state between 8 to 10 p.m. after having their first meal breaking the fast, which was after a whole day of working and being in a dehydrated state, because you can't have, for those who don't know, fluids during Ramadan fasting either. They actually got better gains significantly in terms of strength performance and non-significantly in terms of changes in actual muscle cross-sectional area. And I know this question is about cutting, but I think this is important that most data, even when people are trying for in this study, for example, trying to put on muscle size, people lose weight during Ramadan. It's just so challenging during relatively extreme time-restricted feeding to not end up in a deficit to some degree. So it is an ideal time to be like, look, I'm going to end up cutting no matter what. So I think what you want to focus on is just trying to make the most of your training and nutrition to support your training in the context of Ramadan, to hold on to as much muscle mass as possible. And also a very encouraging finding is that in both groups, even the group that trained while fasting before they had that break fast evening meal, they still maintained their muscle size while there were slight non-significant increases in the other group. So I think to get the most out of it, you got these two meals, they're pretty far apart. They're both while the sun is down, either before it comes up or after it goes down. You're probably going to want to try to split that 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein between those two meals. For most sized males, I think this is a male asking this question. Am I just making a random sexist assumption here? What's the name?
I don't know the name.
Okay.
No
Yes.
need to make the assumption anyway.
So anyway, yeah, random sexist assumption that I made already. Too late. Can't help it. I am who I am. But if you were a male, this is probably going to be between 60 to 75 grams of protein between meals. If we're talking about the typical weight and 1.6 grams per kilogram, and probably about 10-20% less than that per meal if you're the typical size woman. And I've dug myself a hole of sexism. Help me out.
No, I want to dig it a little bit deeper, Helms. So I found the name. The name is Devil 4. Is that a man or a woman to you?
I will not answer that question. Moving along. So we've got our protein split evenly between two meals. We actually have recent data to indicate that that's not as much of a big deal as we think. Ideally, you're getting 3 protein servings per day or more, but the relatively negligible effects of going down from 3 to 2 are exactly that, relatively negligible, and it is a higher priority to simply hit that protein amount. So I think the big things you want to focus on are getting your protein in, and then consuming meals that are easy on the stomach, especially in that first meal, that you're going to have, the evening meal after the sun goes down, right before you train, so that you're not feeling bloated in the gym, and getting a lot of hydration emphasized there as well, and probably drinking first before you start eating, and then training in that fed state. So I think if you do those things, and you don't really worry too much about how big is my caloric deficit, et cetera, and just making those 2 very productive, hydrated, high protein, and then, meals with probably a serving of vegetables, a serving of fruit, but then focusing more on carbohydrates and some moderate fat intake, and not worrying about it too much, the calorie size, just kind of going by how fed you feel, will still induce a deficit, and it should allow you to hold on to your gains. Anything that you think I didn't cover well in terms of the world of intermittent fasting that could apply there? Trex, I know this is something you're really well read on as well.
No, I think you nailed it. And I think Ramadan is a really unique and really interesting challenge in sports nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
I know someone and follow them on social media who was the sport nutritionist for a soccer team, also known as football in the rest of the world.
Yes.
And he was the sport nutritionist for the national team in a country where the vast majority of the population was Muslim. And
Mm-hmm.
so I believe the entirety of his team was observing Ramadan during a really important tournament. And so it's one thing for lifting to say, hey, this Ramadan fasting, we need to plan for it. But man, you're talking about soccer or football. The sweat losses, it's such an arduous, demanding sport, and for games that take place in the late afternoon, toward the end of that fasting period, seeing some of the protocols they were implementing for especially for hydration, man, talk about getting really creative and pulling all the tools out of the bag. It was really fascinating to see. But no, I think you nailed it. And that brings us to the last question I thought was worth addressing here. Well, many of them were worth addressing, but we are really crunched for time here. We're way over. But we had a question about just kind of how we talk about back training. So a lot of people lump all back musculature into one category, right? If you talk about training splits, people say that's my back day, right? But there are a lot of different muscle groups that comprise what we typically lump into the back. So the question is, shouldn't we talk about it more in terms of like lower back versus upper back and kind of separate things out into individual kind of muscles or muscle groups? So, just to kind of be more clear with how we discuss back training. Now, my personal approach, I agree. I've never really lumped all back training into one thing. I have preferred to kind of have 3 categories of what I would call pulling movements, right? So I would talk about vertical pulling movements, so things like a lat pull down or a pull up or a chin up. I would talk about horizontal pulling movements. So basically a lot of your typical row varieties or variations. And then the third category I would call kind of not as good of a term for it, but basically anything that is like a shrug or something that's really targeting that like upper middle back. If we're really trying to focus in on the traps and the rhomboids, that's kind of my third grouping of back exercises. So when I'm mentally putting together a training split, I'm not thinking where does back day go? I'm thinking where's the smartest place to incorporate my horizontal pulling? Where should I incorporate my vertical pulling? And then where should I incorporate any movements that are more trap or rhomboid focused? Helms, do you have a heuristic you like to use for that?
I think that's perfectly acceptable. And I think heuristics are great just so long as they are not so simple as to end up being counterproductive. An example of that is bodybuilders struggling with where to put deadlifts, is whether they're a leg day movement or a back day movement. And that is also confounded by the insistence on powerlifting purists that deadlifts is the best back exercise. And if we're talking about erectors, maybe, but it's absolutely not the best way to train your lats. Anyone with any kind of understanding of anatomy would be able to tell you that, because this is, again, an oversimplified heuristic. So I think, yeah, if we're talking about trying to hypertrophy specific muscles of the back, that's a great way to look at it. I would say that almost all erector training is better placed on a leg day that is a little more, and if you have multiple leg days, maybe one's more focused on glutes and hamstrings, that's a good place to put it, because it's very challenging. Yeah. It's very challenging to do, back extension and target the erectors without also targeting the glutes and hamstrings with almost every movement that is used. So I would just say that don't consider deadlifts a back exercise outside of the erectors, and they're probably better placed on leg days. And then I'm perfectly fine with your heuristic.
Yeah, I basically lump the erectors, lower back. I lump that into kind of what I'd call more like the lower body posterior chain.
Posterior chain.
Yeah, I'd lump it all in there. If I'm doing glutes and hamstrings, if I were to do some direct lower back work, that's where I'd put it. Yeah. So yeah, I agree. It's an oversimplification, but man, I would really not encourage people to get too bogged down in the details of like, well, actually today I'm doing Terry's major, like it's okay, yep. Man. Just, we can kind of simplify it more into the movement rather than all the specific little, musculature that we're targeting with any given movement. Because I've never seen good things come from people that are spending a whole lot of time fretting over, these little tiny individual muscle groups and trying to target them super strategically. I think sometimes keeping it simple can be a breath of fresh air. It could be a nice way to organize things. All right, Helms, I think that does it for tonight. Do you have any parting messages for the good people?
No, I just want to thank everybody for following along, asking good questions, and hopefully my thoughts meandering about stretching weren't too hard to follow.
No, I thought you did a fantastic job. We love having you on the show. I appreciate your time. And there is one problem, though, something that kind of is worrying me and concerning me. The number of views that we got tonight is fantastic. I'm really happy about that. But the number of views is dramatically higher than the number of likes, which could indicate that people just don't like what we're doing and they're hate watching, which I still invite. If you want to hate watch, you can even drop a comment.
Let us be your car crash.
Keep watching. I mean, boost the engagement. Tell us how much you hate it. Don't do a thumbs down or anything. Don't leave a rating, but jump in the comments. Get things going here. But the more likely scenario is that people just forgot. That is technically the admission price. If you watch the show, you are obligated to give it a like, little thumbs up on YouTube. Engage with it however you can engage with it on whatever platform you're using. But right now on the live YouTube, make sure you give it a like on the way out the door. We very much appreciate it. We appreciate all the support we can get for our show here. But yeah, that does it for tonight. We will be back in exactly 1 week, another live episode, Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time with a time change. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will be back soon.